Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. My name is David S. Huber, and I am an artisan briar pipe maker. Today, I'm going to take some time and show you all a freehand shaping process that starts without a plan. So, what I've done so far is I went to my briar inventory, I picked out a block that looked nice, and I came over to the wheel to start cleaning it up. So the first thing that I'm doing is sanding away all of the plateau to reveal the bird's eye grain. And here I'll show you what it looks like when the plateau has been removed. And so you can get a nice view of all the little bird's eyes on the block. So a key to this process is that I'm going to be isolating the grain first. So at this point I have no idea what I'm going to make. I just know that the block looks pretty good, and I'm interested in finding out what the grain looks like once I've carved away all the stuff I don't want. Here is an example of something I don't want. We've got a bit of branch and a bit of a bald spot in this corner of the block. And the reason that I am taking this approach with this block, and this is an approach that I take with some frequency. I find it to be very freeing creatively and really allows me the opportunity to work fluidly with the material. And briar mills cut briar blocks in a way where they're usually square on both sides, and the grain pattern may or may not be organized in such a way that it shows up on the sides really clearly. Oftentimes grain can fan, and so here I'm showing I've eliminated a good portion of the part I don't want, but it is still visible, and there's still some wide grain and some of that branch in there. But so briar mills cut their blocks in a way that they can be put into a chuck and turned. However, with freehand pipe making, that's not the approach that we take. And now there are multiple ways to approach freehand pipe making. This is just one of them, but I plan to show at least one other, in future videos. But so, since briar mills cut blocks in that way, there are often spots that we just don't want. So now you see that area is mostly eliminated, and we're beginning to see the grain pattern. So by eliminating the parts that we don't want, I'm beginning to isolate the straight grain in the part of the block that I want to work with. And yeah, that's looking pretty nice. And so the next step is going to be for me to isolate the grain. And what that's going to mean is I'm going to shape the block down until I have isolated straight grain all the way around. And there are three distinct grain patterns, I guess four, truthfully, distinct grain patterns that we see frequently on pipes and in briar blocks. So we've got straight grain, which is when the shaping has been done in such a way that the vertical grain pattern is easily visible and unbroken. Then we've got flame grain. Flame grain is transitional grain between straight grain and bird's eye grain, and often looks like flames. Bird's eye grain. Oh, here's another reason that freehand pipe making is so useful. you can catch flaws like this big one and remove them prior to drilling. If I had drilled this before I shaped it, I might have had to throw the block away. But so bird's eye grain is the end grain of the straight grain. And so you can also see an example of this when you have the raw block that you have not done anything on yet. The outside of the block, or the plateau where the bark is essentially shows the pattern of the grain inside of the block as it emerges towards the outside. And as you saw earlier, when you remove the plateau, you can see the end grain of the straight grain of the block. Now the fourth type of grain is ring grain. And most people, I believe, are familiar with the concept of growth rings, and that's exactly what ring grain is in a briar block. We utilize ring grain through a sandblasting process, which I expect I will show in a later video. But so now I'm beginning to sand away the raw edges of the block, the parts that were cut before I received the block, in order to get the straight grain isolated better, so I have a clearer idea of what I'm working with. And as I do that, there are some lines that are beginning to emerge, and they may or may not be the lines that I ultimately use in the pipe that I'm going to shape. But it is always interesting to me to find each block has a distinct sort of shape and line to it as you isolate the grain at first. And we're still trying to maximize the block here. So even though once the grain is isolated, it won't look like what a block looks like when it comes from a mill. And I think you'll see why it doesn't make a lot of sense for briar mills to cut blocks in that way. But it makes a lot of sense, for me anyway, to isolate the grain in getting a freehand pipe shaped. So we'll keep a lot of the original block by the time the grain has been isolated, but I will have sanded away quite a lot of it in order to get a really good idea and kind of a start to the shape, where it'll define the limitations on what I can do and still use the most grain out of this block. And you'll notice that I frequently dip the block into a bucket of water that's off camera in order to better see the grain that I'm working with. And that helps me to better see if I am catching the grain in a straight way or a flame grain way. And really what I'm aiming for is to get those really nice, clean, straight lines. So now we've come to the stage where not planning ahead of time results in a good deal of thoughtful consideration about where to go. I've isolated the grain for the most part and eliminated a lot of the pieces of the block that were there, or the edges of the block that were created when the mill cut it. You can see there's a little piece left, and I frequently will clean that up just to continue to help myself have a clearer idea of what I'm working with. And so you can see me doing that here. And as I've done this process, there's sort of a panel that's emerged, a curved panel where the bird's eye is, that is rather interesting. And that is the kind of thing that will often define the direction that I take a piece when I am using this process. This process is also highly generative of new shapes. So even though it takes a bit longer than a pre-planning process, it does allow for some interesting creativity, as there's a great deal of the block left, all of the grain is fully isolated, and the process has allowed me to create some preliminary lines that work with the grain and may also reveal some interesting ideas that I could play with. So now I've made some decisions about where I want to go, or I've got a clear idea of what I want to do now. And so I'm starting to define those bottom lines. That nice curved panel could have been the bottom of a piece. It could have been the top of a piece. It could have been the side of a piece. And as I am considering I've decided to go with the side. So now I'm making some initial cuts here to start to define the shank and the bowl. But at this point, I know that I'm going to be making a Fugu Blowfish. Now, the Fugu Blowfish is a design that was originated by Hiroyuki Tokutomi, who's one of the masters of the Japanese school of pipe making. He studied with Sixten Iversen, who is widely regarded to be the father of modern pipe making. You can see that there's the beginning of some definition and profile, but very little from top or bottom. One of the things that I love about this design concept is the infinite variability that's possible. And so now that I know what shape I'm going to make, I'm going to really start dialing in the shape in a rough way to really define the shank and the lines that connect one end of the pipe with the other. And as I do this, I'm making sure that all the panels that are present are still staying focused on the grain. So all that work that I did to isolate the grain beforehand doesn't get lost in the process of dialing the shape in. So while I'm getting this shape dialed into something close to the final shape that the piece will be, I'm going to talk a little bit about my shaping setup here. So I'm shaping on an 80 grit resin back disc, and there are lots of different shaping setups that people use all over the world, and this one is one of the more common. It uses tools that are pretty readily available, and I find it to be very versatile and comfortable to work with. Some people use like hard-backed discs, and some people use something more like a French disc, though I don't think many people use French discs for rough shaping. And I have this mounted on a Balder motor. It's a 3-phase, 3,650 RPM motor. I have that attached to a VFD drive, which is a variable frequency drive, which allows me to control the speed of the motor between 0 and max. And so with this disc, I always shape at the max speed. I don't necessarily recommend that for beginning pipe makers, but as you grow in your skill, the high speed really helps take material off quickly. As I move up to higher grit discs, which are French discs, I will drop the speed down. So when I get to 220 grit, which is the first grit I use after drilling to start cleaning up the shape, I'll go to 1200 RPM. And so you can see the fundamental shape is now in place, and I can do a little bit of detail work even at this grit. The dust collection setup that I use, I got from Nene Iversen. The garbage can here is just one that I purchased from a local hardware store, and then modified it so that it could be a great catchment that was also comfortable for me to sit in front of. The dust collection port is at the bottom, and I cut out a 4-inch hole in order to fit the ducting there, and it's mounted to the workbench with a few screws and then stabilized there with a 2x4 that is also attached to the bench. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner of the video a little peg which is mounted to that 2x4. And I really like having that there, because after I drill a piece and I come back to this shaping tool in order to refine the piece I'm working on, I can put the pipe on that dowel whenever I need to change my discs, which keeps me from having to lay the piece down on the workbench and potentially having it roll off and have a piece break. It's secure and easy in access and out of the way, and it's just it's one of those little useful details in the shop that really improves the process. So right now I'm dialing in some detail on these bird's eye panels on the side of the bowl for this Fugu Blowfish. Some defining characteristics of this design are distinctive panels on both sides of the bowl that show off the bird's eye grain that is present in the block. And you might notice that throughout the process, I'll stop and check some of my lines, the orientation, the positioning, in particular where the shank meets the bowl. In this process, it's still important to make sure that all of your lines have good flow and that your fundamental shape is lined up in the way that you want it to be. And so as we get closer, there will be smaller and smaller adjustments. Even so, at this grit, I'm not going to get really, really specific. Reason being is that the next step is drilling, and that is going to define the refinement process. So now we've refined this shape idea quite a bit. We're very close to being ready to drill. And as a matter of fact, this is ready to drill now. However, there is a design element that I like to use on Fugu Blowfish that I always put onto the piece before I drill it. And that is a nice inside curve into a voluptuous outside curve on one or both sides of the bowl. This adds a great deal of organicism to the design, and it really highlights the energy of the piece. So now I'm closing in on some of these rough details on the panels, and once those are complete, I'll be ready to take this pipe over to the lathe to drill it. And I will include that in a future video. My intent is to do a series of videos following this piece from beginning to end. And so if you enjoyed this video and you're interested in seeing more, including the journey that this piece takes after I've completed the shaping here, I hope that you will hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. In addition to videos following the process on this piece, I intend to do other crafting videos about pipes, showing the tools and processes that I use to make some fine and high-grade artisan briar pipes. So that's the piece as it is rough shaped, and now it's ready to get drilled. Until next time, be well and happy pipe making.